Well, but doesn't it feel, don't you get a feeling of satisfaction of having been involved in the inauguration,
I really do. I was one of the people that helped run the drive to build Baptist Hospital. You know, it was a general fund drive. I know the Baptist churches paid a good part of it, but the general public made many, many contributions for that. And all of those things obviously are a source of satisfaction.
How long were you with WPAD?
Well, I stayed there over a 14-year period, actually 13 years, because in the fall of '56, the CBS network announced it was going to start giving out kind of a Nobel Prize each year and reward some of the outstanding young newscasters in the country, take them to New York and let them intern there for a year, and they'd go to Columbia University. And they could either take classes for credit or they could just audit, whatever they wanted to do. So you had to fill out an application form. Well, I didn't think it amounted to anything. I didn't think I'd win, so I just pitched it in the wastebasket. And there was a man working for me there, an announcer who'd graduated at Murray State, named Sam Elliott. And so he fished that up and looked at it, and he said, "I know the reason you're not going to enter." He says, "You're just too doggone stingy to pay for a 3-cent stamp." And he reached down in his pocket, took out 3 pennies, and laid them on my desk, says, "You're pretty good at trivia and so forth," and said, "I imagine if you win this first round and go to New York to be examined for the second, why, you'll win the second round." And said, "I'll pay the 3 cents. And all of them kidded me a lot about it, Doc Morris and Lynn Wolfe and the lackeys. So Mr. Lackey thought it was a big joke at that time. Later he got a little sore at me after I actually did win it, because he said I'd never come back. But that must have been about September of '56.
And the magazine you had in your lap was about 55, the summer before the anniversary. Could we see what Ray Mofield looked like when he went to Columbia?
You know, I went to WPAD on its anniversary day, August the 23rd, 1945. The station was, at that point, 15 years old. Now, this little thing that Ben Smith and I put together, Ben was an engineer and a good writer, chose some people. There's Mr. Lackey, the boss man, Pierce, and his brother Pruitt.
Let's see if we can get it around here.
And then that was a picture of the new FM transmitter and the AM transmitter. There's a little repeat of the history where the station going on the air August 23rd, 1930 from the top of the Ritz Hotel. And there's Ray Mofield when he went to Columbia University. I was 36 years old in 1957 when I made that trip.
And by that time you had moved from being chief announcer
to assistant manager. As I said, unfortunately Gene Peake died. And a very young man. He was then mayor of Paducah at his death. I took his place and became the assistant manager, but by that time I had carved out sort of a niche for myself in news and sports. And
so you were also sort of a
incidentally, let's take a look at this. This was the old PAD transmitter at 8th and Terrell, and this shows it at the very height of the flood. The flood water
39.
In 1937, the highest water got almost to 61 feet. I believe it was 60.8 feet on February the 2nd, and then you see it starts dropping a little.
And where was this?
This was North 8th and Terrell. Now, after the war, when we built the new operation, we moved across the street, the other side of, and on out toward what was then the Magnavox plant, and put up a 417-foot tower. We did that so we could put FM on it. Mm-hmm. The old tower wouldn't hold FM. It was, and by the way, that's the first FM station in Kentucky, and the first station I had anything to do with building. And then Mr. Lackey started having me build stations everywhere. First one was, I'd been there less than a year, and he'd gotten a permit to build a station, WKTM, in Mayfield, Kentucky. I learned everything I ever knew almost from Pierce Lackey, either just experimenting on my own. I did the first license renewal under the Blue Book form. He handed me that form one morning and says, get back there every chance you get and take it home with you at night and work that out, and says, I'll give you $10 extra to file a license renewal. Well, I said, Mr. Lackey, I don't know a thing about filing license renewals. I didn't even know you had one. And he said, well, they've changed all the forms. Said they're nothing like they used to be, so nobody knows one earthly thing about it. Now, you've been to Murray State, haven't you? Surely you can figure out how to do a license renewal. So I did that. And everything that arose, an order would come in, let's say from a company that they'd say, we're going to buy advertising from any station that has a farm director. I know he brought that in one morning, laid his hands on my shoulder, and he says, Ray, you got big shoulders. Says, you're now the farm director.
Just kept adding titles to you.
So pretty soon I was everything, except owner and general manager. Well, anyway, to get back to Mayfield, Doc Morris and I flew to work, and we got a transmitter from Gates up at Quincy, Illinois, and a tower from Wind Charger in Newton, Iowa, and went to Nashville and got a truck and brought a tent from Nashville, tent and awning. There wasn't even any power out the road where we'd gotten a place to build it, on the Fancy Farm Road out of Mayfield. So there was no telephone line. We had to run telephones out there for the news wire. We got REA to run us a power line out there, poured a concrete slab, stretched that tent over it, and went on the air 3 weeks later. We broke the world's record. Made broadcasting a big story in that. And then later, they spent 3 or 4 months, and I guess along about October, November, we went into our studios in the old Mayfield Hotel on Main across from the Mayfield Messenger.
But you're actually broadcasting and on the air
in 3 weeks.
That is quite an accomplishment.
Yeah, so that was really something. A hot, dusty summer, and there we were in a tent on the Fancy Farm Road. Well, there was Lynn Wolf, was the sales manager, and there's Evelyn Stahl, who was woman's director. She was a great one. Came from Cynthiana, Kentucky, and a graduate of Miami University, Oxford, Ohio, by the way. And there's Jim Youngblood, the old disc jockey. Jim had been a great musician. He was a trumpeter. He played in Francis Craig's band. He'd played the Paramount in New York and all those things, but finally got tired of it. Wanted to be a DJ. Well, I brought him in, put him on FM only. And then we switched him to AM. He was just awfully clever. And this was Martha Ward, who was the traffic manager, and Fay Mathis was the secretary. A couple of our bookkeepers, Nell Ford and Carolyn Rue. The announcers at that time were George Williams, Bill Inman, Jim Hankins from Metropolis. Got a degree from SIU Carbondale later, and then went to work for let's see, the Lynn Corporation. And this was our FM control and master control and the AM control. The engineer, the chief was U.C. Morris and Benny Smith and Paul Johnson. And I guess, there was our new 10 kilowatt FM transmitter, and here was our mobile unit. That's a 46 or 7 Ford there. We had a 40-watt Collins in it, and we also had a quarter-watt RCA, and we broadcast the Irvin Cobb Golf Tournament. You know, we could do anything that could be done. One of the few stations in Kentucky that had mobile equipment.
Well, I can see why you'd be reluctant to leave all of this state-of-the-art broadcast facility to go off to Columbia, but You did get the scholarship.
Well, I did. We went, and I entered, and about the middle of March, I got a telegram saying, "We've picked the 20 finalists, and you're one of them. We'll pay your way to New York, want you to come, and you go through 2 days of oral exams." Says, be quite a distinguished board giving you the examination. Ed Murrow will do it. Sig Mickelson, the vice president for news. Dr. Peterson, vice president of Columbia University. Lewis Johnson, who is the ambassador, or the chairman of the Carnegie Foundation for International Peace, and Mr. Lou Douglas, who was the ambassador to Great Britain. So CBS believed in doing it upright. So we went in there, and they asked everything on the face of the earth. A lot of it was trivia. And as you know, I'm noted around Murray State, at least, for being the trivia buff. And it just so happened, everything they asked, if they asked how tall the Washington Monument was, why, I said it's 555 feet and 6 inches. And after the second day, they didn't tell us whether we won or not. In fact, we didn't learn until about 2 weeks later. And I got a telegram. As I remember, it was on April the 1st, April Fool's Day.
Oh, you came back here after the initial
after the
examinations.
And we didn't start to Columbia that fall, until that fall of '57. And Janie, my wife, said, "Well, how do you think you did?" I said, "I'm afraid I've won."
You felt confident.
Well, at that point, I was a little sad to think about going. For one thing, I was terrified. I'd been out of college 16 years. I'd read about all these bright, sharp young college students and how much they knew, and I thought, well, now, when you went to Murray State, you could have flunked out and nobody would have ever known it, because you were just a sharecropper, son. But now it's in the New York Times. It's in the Broadcasting Magazine. The whole world has been told that you're going to Columbia as one of America's great young newscasters. And you've been paid a tax-free stipend of $8,500. Now, if you fall on your face,
everybody will know it.
Everybody will know it. So, Frank, I was scared. I really was scared. And I had that sudden feeling then that, well, maybe I ought to back out and not try it. But my wife said, "Why, you've gone too far now. You can't back out." She wanted me to go, so which I did.
And did she stay here?
She stayed here. My dad was living at that time in very poor health. My mother had already died, and so she said, I want you to go. I want you to get your master's. Well, I went to Columbia, and I told them I'd like to work the master's off, and they said, "Well, you can't do it in 9 months. It takes 1 full year." And I said, "Is there a rule against it?" No rule against it. Well, I said, "Well, why can't I do it then?" He said, "Well, nobody ever has." So I began working very hard. I got my thesis topic approved, passed the Spanish language. I subscribed to, you had to have a foreign language then, even to get a master's at Columbia. And I subscribed to Life in Spanish, made myself read Life every week.
In Spanish?
In Spanish. So I would, and you know, that wasn't any problem for me at all, and to pass the language exam. I began doing an economic study. Dr. Carter Goodrich was one of the teachers, and he decided that he would help supervise my examination in economics. And Arthur Burns, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve Board until fairly recent times, you may remember, was chairman of the department. It was a very distinguished department. Leo Woolman, who wrote the Wagner Act for Franklin Roosevelt in 1935, and was the labor economics teacher. And Carl Schaup, who set up the Japanese economy for Japan after World War II for MacArthur, I took public finance under him. I took taxation under C. Lowell Harris, who has written the most used textbook in America.
Why did you decide to do your master's work in economics again rather than communications?
Columbia had a peculiar rule. Now later NBC started something in imitation, I think, of CBS, and I know Jack Paxton called me about it and wanted me to help advise him on what to do. How did I win in New York? So he entered the NBC thing. Now they made you take either journalism or broadcasting. And Jack became quite a worldwide figure on NBC network. And he took broadcasting. But CBS was just the opposite. They said you can take anything in the College of Social Sciences. You cannot take either broadcasting or journalism because we figure that you have those basic skills. Now we want you to have something to talk about. And there were 5 departments in the college at Columbia, and that was government or political science, some people call it. And there was history, sociology, geography, and economics. Did I name all of them?
I think so.
Yeah, okay. Well, out of that group, I thought, well, I believe economics might be better. An awful lot of the news is made in economics. The price of hamburger is continuously interesting to people. So I asked for admission to the Department of Economics, and they granted it. And I started with Dr. Goodrich then says, why don't you do an economic study? He said, you're from Paducah. Why don't you do an economic study on the cost to America of building Oak Ridge in the middle of a cornfield and doing the whole thing, fire department, police, hospital, schools, all, and the cost of taking an already existing city, Paducah, and erecting a gaseous diffusion plant there, the same as they did in Oak Ridge. Now, of course, obviously it was going to be cheaper in Paducah, although there were economic costs, such as traffic jams, you know. They had to expand the schools. Paducah didn't have dial telephones.
The Paducah exploded when
It absolutely went wild. From a town of 30,000, it had 67,000 overnight.
Doubled, yeah.
Just doubled. So that was an interesting period. Well, I began to write, and I'd gone through that period, and it was fresh in my mind, but when you start citing something in a thesis, you've got to give the exact. So I started writing letters to everybody, and by Christmas, I'd written George Jacobson, who was then the mayor, and I'd written Mike Summersheim, who was head of Bell Telephone, what all they had to do, and I'd written the school people, and I had letters in the file. I had all my material ready to start writing. So when the second semester started, I wrote that thesis and graduated on June the 4th, first person in the history of Columbia University, so I was told, to ever finished in 9 months.
And then did you come back home?
I came back to Kentucky, and
did you have any opportunities to go on? I mean, if you'd gone to Columbia and if you'd had the association with Edward Murrow, and here you'd finished your master's program and you'd had a certain amount of notoriety, did you have any opportunities to make a career in New York or other places?
Well, yes, I did, and some of those people took advantage. By the time the program was over, there were 8 altogether who were in it, and they were offered a chance, but my wife had flown up, and we had gone to see My Fair Lady and a few Broadway shows, and we enjoyed all that, but living in Manhattan was pretty tough, and it was not the kind of thing that a country boy from Hardin really likes. And my wife hated it, and then there was my father to think about. He wouldn't have wanted to have lived there, so I decided I'd just come back. So I started working in Benton, and then almost immediately Mr. Lackey said, well, I want you to come back here, so I did. And I stayed there then till 59, when I resigned and took a job at SIU Carbondale, teaching.
A teacher there.
Yeah, they had offered me a job in 58. In fact, they offered me a job in 57, but I had already accepted the scholarship to Columbia. Then when I came back, they wanted me to take it, and I said, well, no, I'm going to manage the Benton radio station. And they didn't offer me very much money. They were hiring people. They had no full-time station in Carbondale, and President Morris, who was turning that school into a great university with law and medicine and dentistry and engineering and everything, and into a school with campuses in Carbondale, Edwardsville, the School of Dentistry in Alton, and the School of Medicine in Springfield. He wanted their ball games broadcast, and they'd tried a couple of PhDs, and they'd both failed. And so a boy who had worked for me at Metropolis named Jim Hankins, whose picture we looked at a minute ago, now in Pittsburgh, had told Dr. Morris one day, said, the fellow you need's Mofield. Said, boy, he can put the sports on. You won't have to worry about him going on if he's there. And said, the only thing, he doesn't have a doctorate. Morris said, well, I don't care what he's got, if he can do the job. So I kept holding out for the permission to do my doctorate, and see, I was asking for $7,800. That was a little more than most of the PhDs were then making. They finally gave me $7,500 and agreed to free tuition and permission to do the doctorate, which I worked off in 4 years. Stayed there 5. And
got your master's in 9 months and took 4 years to get your doctorate.
Yeah, that's right. But I remember I was teaching 16 hours as a full-time. I wasn't a graduate assistant.
Plus you were doing all the ball games?
Yeah, I did the ball games.
You didn't drive the school bus for
No, I didn't drive the school bus.
I think you've just always had a tendency to do as many jobs as you could.
I always did. Of course, I went to Southern in the fall of '59. And then the next year was the Nixon-Kennedy campaign. And I originated the broadcast for both Nixon and Kennedy at McAndrew Stadium. And I became famous on the Kennedy broadcast. They were an hour and a half late, and I had lived for an hour and a half.
On the air?
On the air. They dumped me out there at the stadium, and they wouldn't tell me anything, you know, and so I just kept going.
And said you're on, and so you...
And so I was on. I guess the chairman was either trying to make me or break me. Well,
your wealth of trivia come in handy at that moment.
Oh, did it come in handy. I told every story in the book. Well, after being commended for that, then I did the Nixon broadcast also. And so we had some good experiences at Carbondale. I interviewed Adlai Stevenson, and
got to meet some names.
Senator Paul Douglas was then the senator from, and of course, Everett McKinley Dirksen. The Courier Journal called the Wizard of Ooze, was a great speaker, senator from Illinois.
Had a rough, gravelly
Oh, yeah,
voice.
way down low.
Love to listen to him talk.
So,
well, when did you, and was it 64 that you came back to
yes,
Murray?
Dr. Woods called me. He called me really, I guess, in '63 and asked me if I said, Dr. Woods, I'm right in striking distance of having my doctorate now. And I've got a good setup. I'm making $8,200. By that time, I'd gotten some small raises. And I'd love to work for you. I'd like to be your executive assistant, which is the job he offered me. But he said, well, the minute you graduate, you'll let me know. Well, he'd read in the paper something about the fact that I was going to get my degree, and so he called me. And I finished my work in March. So then I called him back in a few days and told him that it was now certain. I had finished the work, and I'd march across the stage in June the 4th, I believe, and that I would consider coming to Murray if he were still interested. So he said, oh yeah. He says, I want you to start, says, come by this weekend, we'll sign a contract, and I'll pay you $9,600, he said. That'll give you more than about $1,200 raise, or $1,400 raise. Well, that sounded real good. So I went by and we signed the contract, and about a week after that, he said, well, why don't you just come on now? I said, Dr. Woods, I can't do that. I've got a contract through June the 30th. Well, he said, you can start July the 1st then. And I said, I've bought tickets to the New York World's Fair, and I'd like to have off a couple of weeks. I've been going here pretty high speed. I've taught 16 hours every term and done all the ball games.
16 hours.
And you know, 16 college hours is a full load for anybody. And on top of that, I'm doing that, and really, there was a man who used to teach at Paducah Tillman Trade School named O.B. Ray. He's a member of the Church of Christ, and he had gone to Carbondale and was head of the front end department in the automotive school. They had a school they call vocational and professional, and it was kind of a community college type thing with many vocational subjects. They trained undertakers and hairdressers. They call it cosmetology and so on. You know. So when the preacher left at Carbondale, and O.B. Ray had known me when all those years in Paducah, and he said, well, Ray, you can preach for us. So I preached every Sunday at Carbondale on top of that, and taught a Bible class on Wednesday night. So I had been a busy boy. I took all of my...
You needed a vacation.
I took 96 hours of doctoral work, quarter hours. I passed 2 foreign languages, passed the comprehensives, and wrote a dissertation of 400 pages, and got it approved in 4 years. So I think I deserved 2 weeks off. He said, well, all right. You can't get anybody to work these days. Dr. Woods,
hard to get good.
Dr. Woods was an old timer. I loved him. I still do. He was a great man, and I learned a lot from him as I did from Pierce Lackey. But that's how I came to be at Murray, and I stayed there through, he was 66 years old, and Kentucky law says you have to retire at 70. So in his 70th year, he retired, and Dr. Sparks became president.
Were you at a while there, almost acting president of Murray? Did Dr. Woods become ill?
Well, in effect, that's right. He did have a heart attack somewhere around the 1st of June of 1967. And the board didn't meet and didn't act until July the 3rd. So there was actually a month there when I was de facto president. Mm-hmm. The board then met and named Marvin Rather, whom I mentioned earlier as doing almost everything. He had served as acting president once before when Dr. Woods was in Europe for the State Department, setting up the Greek educational system following World War II. And it was part of the Truman Doctrine plan. They were fighting communism there. So Rather had been acting president during that period. So the board named him acting president. But you're right, for a month there, I was president, not officially. But in fact, I signed some rather big contracts. I signed the contract to build University High School, the building we're meeting in now. Mm-hmm. And just with a great flourish, you can go look it up in Frankfurt if you want. I guess it says Executive Assistant to President Woods, Ray Mofield, and that was about a $3 million contract.
And when Dr. Sparks became president?
When Dr. Sparks became president, Dr. Woods had wanted me to use my degree and set up a Department of Communications, which we put on paper, but in which I really didn't teach. We did that in '65. And we had a division head, Mr. Tracy, in speech. A division head was first Lou Edmondson, later Horton in journalism. and a division head in radio TV with various people over the years, Tom Morgan or Bob Howard, or at one time Betty Hinton. And so it was more or less on paper. And we got approved. You had to have 2 earned doctorates in order to offer a master's in anything. So with somebody in journalism and somebody in speech and someone in radio, TV, and myself, that gave us the degree. But I really was not active. I was working in doing almost everything. Preston Ordway, I think, used to laugh and say that when I left over there and they reorganized the school and named 4 or 5 vice presidents and 4 or 5 or 6 deans and so on, that it took about 25 men to replace me. But be that as it may, I had a good time. But I did student aid, I did the building program. First job, when I went there, I said...
Now, that was when you were still in the administrative
Yeah, still.
office.
I said to Dr. Woods, I said, what in the world do you want me to come here in July for? Classes don't begin. Well, he said, I'm not going to let you teach, but maybe a class in economic history. He said, Doc Lowry wants you to do that because we've never offered it at Murray. We've never had anybody qualified to teach it. But I see your degree's in economic history. And I said, okay, I'll teach that. But what else will I do? Then the teaching load was 15 hours at Murray. 5 3-hour courses. Well, he said, I want you to build a school of nursing. You get with Ruth Cole, who heads the old nursing program. They had a program there they called the diploma plan. And you went to college about 1.5 years, and then you trained at Owensboro or Jenny Stewart in Hopkinsville, and in about a 3-year program altogether, and you became an RN. Of course, after the Higher Education Act of '64 was passed, they began to help build nursing programs at community colleges with 2-year things. And most of those old hospital plans went out of business.
Like the nursing program we have at PCC.
Yeah, so PCC took over part of it, and then Murray State became a link in that with the bachelor's plan to supply faculty to the community colleges and nursing supervisors and hospitals and so on. And then, of course, there were other buildings on it in which there are some 12 schools that offer the doctorate in nursing now. Well, he said, you'll learn that you just, you built a radio station, you can build a nursing school. So we went to New York and got permission from the National League for Nursing to get reasonable assurance of accreditation. Went to Washington, got $1 million grant from the federal people.
Now, you didn't build this nursing school in 3 weeks, did you?
No, I didn't do it in 3 weeks. It took 2 years, as a matter of fact. In the meantime, we finished up Elizabeth Hall, we finished up the Applied Science Building, Agriculture and Home Ec, and Engineering Technology. We added 3 stories to the Education Building. Drew plans for the football stadium. Before I had gone out, we had completed Faculty Hall pretty much. We'd done, nursing was already occupied by then. We'd already built and occupied Sparks Hall, which was the president's office and so on at that time.
Well, when did
Did a lot of building.
When did you, under Harry Sparks, then I guess you became chairman of
Well,
the...
he named me full-time chairman of the Department of Communications, and so he gave me Dr. Wood's old desk, which I still have, by the way.
Oh, really?
Everybody's always saying, well, where did you get such a big desk? I said, well, it came from a big man, 6'4" Ralph Woods. And Dr. Woods had wanted me to have that desk, he said, and so I still have it.
And as chairman then, were you instrumental in starting the radio program and the television program?
Yes, we kept improving that. We I brought in Dr. Follett, the man who made me, as my debate coach, and took me out from behind that double shovel at Hardin and the one-eyed mule. I brought him back from Ohio University. I brought Horton back from Ohio University and put him in journalism. We hired about 3 more people in radio, TV, and I told Dr. Sparks I'd like to have a commercial studio, and he said, okay, I'll pay whatever it costs. And I said, well, I'm going to send out a bid for $600,000 worth of gear here. He said, okay. But RCA bid it in for $404,000. It was a little bit of a recession there, and they did quite a bit of chewing down. But we got those 2 TK-44Bs. We got the 2 quad recorders, RCA TR-60s. We got all those boards, the 2 16mm projectors, and we also built the radio station, FM stereo, WKMS. Went on the air May the 11th, 1970.
That was even before National Public Radio, right?
Yeah, that's right. We didn't have National Public Radio then.
Well, you've
been an exciting time.
Spent just about 20 years now back at Murray.
Yeah.
What sort of future do you see? Because you've come a long way from the, what'd you call it, the double-bladed shovel and the one-eyed mule from Hardin, through quite a career in broadcasting and in higher education. Young men like Ben and Steve and Bob Johnson that are interested in communication, what sort of future do you see from your experience?
Well, it appears to me that we will continue to be an interesting field and a growing field. When World War II was over, I thought most of the growth had already occurred then. After all, we had nearly 1,000 radio stations. And now we've got 1,000 TV, and we got 10,000 radio in the AM and FM field, and they're building circular radio for telephones everywhere, and the whole field of cable is bigger now than the broadcast industry was in 1945.
I think it's just absolutely exciting to be involved right now.
Yeah,
that the future is only limited by our imaginations.
With low-power television, and I have no idea whether that will be an idea whose time has come or whether it may prove to be, I don't think it can entirely flop. There may be some places.
Do you think the advent of cable and television and computers will have an impact on our educational structure, on the way schools are put together and the job that schools do? It would seem to me that they will have to, kids will learn more quicker, faster playing games at home than
the British have started what they call the Open University, and you proceed at your own pace.
As far as you want to go?
Yeah, as far as you want to go, and you ask the computer, and when you know all the answers, you take your tests, and they hand you your diploma, and you may never have seen a school in the traditional sense. Now, we're holding back a little. Of course, there are always people whose oxes are being gored, and there'll be some who will fight the development. But I look for it gradually to come and finally to change our whole concept of getting...
I sometimes think that perhaps schools will become more like hospitals. It'll be an institution people only go to when they're having learning difficulties. And
yeah, that's a very good idea.
And when you have learning difficulties, then you'll go to a school for a specialist that will prescribe remedies for those difficulties.
That's. I wish I'd thought of wording it that way. That's good.
Well, I'm sort of like you and traveling somewhat the same road. Everything that I've learned has been through the field of communications, in talking with people and reading, and it's basic. It's, to me, it is education. Communications is the fundamental basis of all education.
Right. that concept, I'm sure, wouldn't startle Aristotle too much, but in between we had a long period when people didn't realize that very much, did they?
I've got one other question. When did you start handing out pennies for right answers?
You know, I'm not really certain how I got...
maybe it's that 3 cents that was given to you to go to Columbia.
Maybe Sam Elliott's 3 cents to get me to enter the CBS contest. Perhaps it was. And I don't know, I think there was a man in Benton who was a state policeman, a graduate of Louisville Male, and he took a course under me. And so I think I noticed somebody nodding, just about asleep, in the class. So I took out a penny and asked a question and offered a prize, you see. Well, that awakened everyone. And afterwards he said to me, says, you know, that was pretty clever, getting those people to wake up by offering the penny. And said, then you went on and made your other points. Well, after he had noticed it and particularly had cemented it, and I had just tried it as an experiment right on the spur of the moment, then I kept doing those things, and gradually I've become so infamous now that I can't quit.
You have to
live up to my image.
Well, as one of your students, I think it is a way of spicing up the class, which I always find fascinating and interesting, and I've enjoyed the studies that I've had at Murray State. For those of you that may be watching, we've been talking with Dr. Ray Mofield, Professor of Communications at Murray State University. I'm Bob Shy. Thanks for watching.